The first time billionaire Callum Voss asked Vivienne Hale to plan his brother's wedding, she told him no. Not because she was too busy, not because he was difficult, but because when Callum walked into her office, he placed a photograph on her desk that made her hands go completely still. It wasn't a photograph of his brother. It wasn't even a photograph of the bride. It was Vivienne, standing outside a tiny chapel 11 years earlier, wearing a wedding dress she had never gotten the chance to walk down the aisle in. Vivienne slowly lifted her eyes to him. "Where did you get this?" Callum didn't answer. Instead, he slid a thick wedding file across her desk. "My brother gets married in 6 weeks. I want you to plan it." Vivienne pushed the file back. "I've planned 214 weddings, Mr. Voss. Find someone else." Callum didn't touch the file. His eyes remained fixed on hers. "I know exactly how many you've planned." Vivienne should have realized right then that Callum Voss hadn't come to her office simply because he needed a wedding planner. But she didn't. She took the job. And 6 weeks later, on the morning of the wedding, Vivienne was sitting behind her planning desk when Callum leaned over her and quietly said something that made her forget there was a bride standing only 20 feet away. Vivienne, wedding number 215 was never supposed to be theirs. Her face went still. "Then whose wedding have I been planning?" Callum's eyes dropped toward the small velvet ring box sitting between them. And behind him, his brother started laughing. But what Vivienne didn't know was that the answer inside that little box would take her all the way back to the worst day of her life and expose a secret Callum had carried for 11 years. Before we uncover what Callum was really hiding, subscribe if you enjoy emotional stories filled with secrets, second chances, and unexpected turns. And stay until the end, because when Vivienne finally learns why that old photograph was taken, everything changes. Now let's begin. Her name was Vivienne Hale. For 11 years, she had made a living creating perfect days for other women. She knew which flowers survived summer heat, which songs could make even the toughest fathers cry, and exactly how to rescue a wedding when the cake collapsed 2 hours before the ceremony. People called her one of the best wedding planners in the city. But there was one wedding Vivienne could never fix. Her own. 11 years earlier, at 24, she had been preparing to marry a man named Adrian. She loved him completely, and she believed he loved her just as much. Until 3 hours before their ceremony, Adrian disappeared. There was no argument, no warning, no explanation, only a short message on her phone. "I'm sorry." Vivienne waited inside that chapel in her wedding dress. 1 hour, then 2. Eventually, the guests went home. Her mother begged her to leave. But Vivienne remained until the chapel manager quietly began turning off the lights. Adrian never came. After that day, Vivienne made herself a promise. She would never again allow another person to have enough power over her heart to destroy it. Instead, she built something. A career. Wedding after wedding. Year after year. Until she'd planned 214 beautiful beginnings for other people. And then Callum Voss walked into her office carrying a photograph nobody should have had. That was the real reason Vivienne accepted wedding number 215. She wanted answers. According to Callum's paperwork, his younger brother Everett was marrying a woman named Celeste Marlowe. But from their very first planning meeting, something felt wrong. Celeste arrived 20 minutes late. Everett arrived 40 minutes late. Callum? He arrived early. Vivienne opened her notebook. "What flowers does Celeste prefer?" "White peonies," Callum answered immediately. Vivienne glanced at him. "And the music?" "Strings. Nothing too modern." She turned toward Everett. "And what does the groom want?" Everett shrugged. "Whatever makes everyone happy." Vivienne slowly lowered her pen. "You're remarkably relaxed for a man getting married." Everett smiled. "And you're remarkably suspicious for a wedding planner." Callum almost smiled. Almost. But Vivienne noticed something else. For a man supposedly planning his brother's wedding, Callum watched her far more than he watched the plans. Over the next 3 weeks, it became impossible to ignore. Whenever Vivienne scheduled a meeting with Everett and Celeste, one of them somehow canceled. Callum never did. Vivienne toured venues with Callum. She tasted wedding cakes with Callum. She selected table settings with Callum. And slowly, against her better judgment, the billionaire she had considered cold and arrogant began surprising her. He remembered how she took her coffee. He noticed when she skipped lunch. And whenever someone spoke over her during a meeting, Callum became silent until they stopped, then looked directly at Vivienne and said, "You were saying?" But he never flirted with her, never crossed the line. And somehow, That made Vivienne even more curious. One afternoon, she was rearranging place cards when she caught him staring at her again. Vivienne stopped. Why do you keep doing that? Doing what? Looking at me like you already know what I'm going to say. Callum leaned against the table. Because usually I do. You don't know me. Something changed in his expression. No. He paused. But I've heard about you for 11 years. Vivienne froze. From whom? Before Callum could answer, the door opened. Celeste walked inside. And for the first time since Vivienne had met her, Celeste wasn't smiling. She looked frightened. She grabbed Callum's arm. We need to talk. The two disappeared into the hallway. Vivienne tried to ignore it. She couldn't. The door hadn't completely closed. Then she heard Celeste's voice. You promised she wouldn't find out until the wedding. Vivienne stopped breathing. Callum answered. Plans changed. Does Everett know? He knows enough. Vivienne stepped backward before either of them could catch her listening. That night, she couldn't sleep. At almost 2 in the morning, she finally climbed out of bed and pulled an old box from the back of her closet. She hadn't opened it in years. Inside were invitations that had never been mailed. A dried flower, her old veil, and the phone where she'd once saved Adrian's final message. But underneath everything was something she'd forgotten. Another photograph. Vivienne picked it up. It showed her and Adrian outside the chapel 2 weeks before their wedding. They were smiling. Young. Happy. But something in the far corner of the photograph caught her attention. A man. Tall. Dark-haired. Watching them. Vivienne brought the photograph closer to the lamp. Her heart began pounding. She knew that face. Callum Voss. The following morning, Vivienne stormed into his office. She dropped the photograph onto his desk. You were there. Callum stared down at it. Yes. 11 years ago? Yes. Vivienne's voice shook. Who are you? Callum's jaw tightened. Someone who should have told you the truth a long time ago. About Adrian? Callum stood. Vivienne. Where is he? Callum said nothing. And suddenly Vivienne understood that his silence wasn't hesitation. It was grief. You know where Adrian is. Callum looked toward the window. I knew. Vivienne frowned. Knew. Then Callum said the words she never expected. He died 8 years ago. Vivienne's knees weakened. She sat down. For 11 years, she had imagined Adrian somewhere in the world. Maybe married. Maybe with children. Maybe happy. And perhaps, every once in a while, remembering the woman he'd abandoned at the altar. She had hated him because hatred was easier than asking herself why she hadn't been enough. But now, Adrian was gone. And Callum had known. Why didn't anyone tell me? Because Adrian asked us not to. Vivienne stared at him. Us. Callum slowly opened his desk drawer. He removed an envelope. Vivienne's name was written across the front. She recognized the handwriting instantly. Adrian's. Her hand shot forward. But Callum didn't release the envelope. Before you read this, there's something you need to know. Give me the letter. Vivienne. Give it to me. Callum released it. Vivienne tore it open. Her hands shook as she began reading. Adrian had written the letter 2 days before their wedding. And finally, after 11 years, Vivienne learned why he never arrived. Months before their wedding, Adrian had been diagnosed with an aggressive illness. He told almost no one, especially not Vivienne. He convinced himself that disappearing would break her heart once, while marrying her would force her to watch him slowly deteriorate. It was a terrible decision, a frightened decision, and one he apparently regretted almost immediately. Then Vivienne reached a sentence that made her stop. She read it again. Then once more. Adrian had written, If you ever meet Callum, don't blame him. He was the only person who told me I was making the biggest mistake of my life. Vivienne looked up. You tried to stop him? Callum nodded. He was my best friend. Vivienne looked at the old photograph. And suddenly she understood. You were outside the chapel because I drove Adrian there. Her eyes widened. You brought him back? I tried. What happened? Callum swallowed. He couldn't get out of the car. Vivienne covered her mouth. He watched you through the chapel window for almost an hour. Tears filled her eyes. Why didn't you tell me? Because I was 28, angry at him, and stupid enough to believe keeping my promise mattered more than giving you the truth. Vivienne stood. And now? Why are you telling me now? Callum looked at her. Because I found that letter after Adrian died. And I've spent 8 years wondering whether giving it to you would heal you, or destroy the life you'd managed to build. Vivienne gave a bitter laugh. So your solution was hiring me to plan your brother's wedding? No. The answer came too quickly. Vivienne's eyes narrowed. Something finally clicked. Everett isn't getting married, is he? Callum's expression changed. Before he could answer, the office door opened. Everett walked inside. Celeste followed. But Celeste wasn't holding Everett's hand. She was holding another woman's. Everett sighed. I told him this was getting ridiculous. Vivienne stared at them. What is happening? Celeste stepped forward and raised her left hand. There was a wedding band on it. I'm already married. Vivienne's mouth fell open. What? For 3 years. Vivienne turned toward Callum. The bride was fake. The groom was fake. The engagement was fake. The entire wedding was a lie. You invented a wedding? Everett lifted one finger. Technically, he invented the engagement. I merely agreed to play myself. Vivienne ignored him. Why? Nobody answered. She stared at Callum. Why would you do this? His voice dropped. Because I knew you wouldn't meet me otherwise. Meet you? I sent Adrian's letter to you 3 times. Vivienne froze. You what? You returned every envelope unopened. Then she remembered. 3 envelopes from Voss Holdings. She'd assumed they were business advertisements. I called your office too, Callum continued. Your assistant said you didn't accept personal appointments. Vivienne stared at him in disbelief. So you created an entire wedding? From behind them, Everett muttered. I asked him that exact question. Callum ignored his brother. I needed 6 weeks. For what? To know whether Adrian was right. About what? Callum moved closer. He wrote something else. Vivienne looked at the letter. There was another page. She unfolded it. And near the bottom was one final paragraph. Adrian had written that Callum would probably hate him for revealing it. Because Callum had noticed Vivienne before Adrian had ever introduced them. And if life had happened differently, perhaps Callum would have been the man standing beside her. Vivienne slowly looked up. You loved me. No. The answer surprised her. Callum stepped closer. I noticed you. That's different. Then why all of this? Because when I found you again years later, you'd become someone I couldn't stop thinking about. He gestured toward her wedding portfolio. 214 weddings. Every photograph. Every couple. You kept creating happy endings for everyone else while refusing to believe you deserved one. Vivienne shook her head. You don't get to decide what I deserve. I know. And you don't get to manipulate me. I know that too. Then what did you expect would happen when I discovered this? Callum looked directly into her eyes. I expected you to hate me. Vivienne blinked. What? I expected you to discover everything and hate me. She stared at him. That is possibly the worst plan I've ever heard. Everett's voice came from the doorway. Finally, someone said it. And despite everything, Vivienne laughed. Just once. Callum smiled. But she still walked away. Because revelations weren't the same as forgiveness. And love wasn't something another person got to arrange like flowers on a table. For 3 days, Callum didn't contact her. Neither did Everett. Then, on the 4th morning, Vivienne received a message. It wasn't from Callum. It was Celeste. Please come to the venue Saturday. There's something you deserve to see. Vivienne almost deleted it. But Saturday morning, she found herself standing outside the venue anyway. When she walked inside, she stopped. Everything was decorated. Her flowers. Her tables. Her lighting. Every detail she'd designed for wedding number 215. Except there were no guests. No orchestra. No groom waiting at the altar. Only Callum, Everett, Celeste, and Celeste's actual wife. Callum approached slowly. I owe you an apology. Yes, you do. I used a lie to bring you into my life because I was afraid the truth wouldn't be enough. Vivienne said nothing. So I'm not asking you to forgive me today. Callum reached into his pocket. He removed a small velvet box. Vivienne immediately stepped backward. Don't. Callum stopped. It's not an engagement ring. She stared at him. Then what is it? He opened the box. Inside was a man's wedding band. Vivienne's face changed. Where did you get that? Adrian gave it to me the night he left. Vivienne's eyes filled with tears. It was the ring Adrian had been supposed to wear 11 years earlier. Callum placed the box into her hand. He told me that if I ever found you, I should give this back. Vivienne looked at him. Why? Not so you'd remember him. Callum paused. So you'd finally understand that what happened wasn't because you weren't worth choosing. For 11 years, Vivienne had secretly carried one question. Why wasn't she enough? And finally, she understood. It had always been the wrong question. Adrian's decision had come from his fear, not from her worth. Vivienne closed the box. Then she looked around the beautifully decorated venue. What happens to all this? Everett smiled. That depends. On what? Callum immediately looked at his brother. Everett. Everett shrugged. What? We've already paid for everything. Celeste started laughing. Then Everett pointed toward the entrance. We invited some people. Vivienne frowned. You said there were no guests. There aren't. He smiled. Yet. The doors behind Vivienne opened. People began walking inside. Dozens of them. But they weren't wedding guests. They were couples. Her couples. People whose weddings Vivienne had planned over the past 11 years. An elderly couple from her very first year. A bride whose father had died shortly before her ceremony. The couple whose outdoor wedding Vivienne had rebuilt indoors during a terrible thunderstorm. One after another, people she'd helped walked into the room. Some carried photographs. Some brought their children. Then one woman approached Vivienne holding a framed wedding photograph. You gave us one of the happiest days of our lives. She smiled. Someone thought you deserved to see what you've spent 11 years creating. Vivienne turned toward Callum. You did this. Callum shook his head. Wedding number 215 isn't mine. Then whose is it? Callum smiled. Yours. Vivienne stared at him. Callum, I am not marrying you today. The entire room burst into laughter. Callum laughed too. Good. Because that would be terrifying. Vivienne couldn't help herself. She laughed with him. Then Callum became serious. This isn't your wedding day, Vivienne. He looked around the room. It's the day you stopped believing your wedding was the most important thing you lost. And that broke something open inside her. Because for 11 years, Vivienne had measured her entire life against one day that never happened. But standing inside that room, surrounded by people whose lives she'd touched, she finally saw everything that had happened afterward. She hadn't spent 11 years waiting. She had spent 11 years living. Callum extended his hand. There was no ring in it. No trick. Just his hand. Can we start again? Vivienne looked at it. No fake weddings. Never. No mysterious photographs. Absolutely none. No manipulating me. Callum hesitated. From across the room, Everett shouted. Think carefully before answering that one. Everyone laughed. Callum smiled. No manipulating you. Vivienne finally placed her hand in his. Then hello. I'm Vivienne. Callum shook it. Callum. And that was how wedding number 215 became the first wedding Vivienne planned. That never happened. At least, not that year. Because 18 months later, Vivienne stood inside that same venue again. Same windows. Same view. Same man. But this time there was no fake bride. No fake groom. No hidden plan. Callum stood at the end of the aisle waiting for her. And Everett? He was Callum's best man. Just before Vivienne walked forward, she opened one small velvet box for the final time. Adrian's ring was still inside. For years, she believed healing meant forgetting him. It didn't. Healing meant being able to remember what happened without allowing that memory to decide what happened next. Vivienne closed the box. She handed it to Everett. Keep this somewhere safe. Then she turned and walked toward Callum. After planning 214 weddings for other people and one wedding that never existed, Vivienne Hale finally planned one for herself. But perhaps the most important thing she learned had nothing to do with weddings. Sometimes, when someone doesn't choose us, we spend years believing they made that decision because something was wrong with us. And without realizing it, we continue making their decision for them. We stop trusting. We stop hoping. Sometimes, we even stop choosing ourselves. Vivienne finally understood that healing wasn't about changing the past. It was about refusing to let the past choose her future. And now there's one question for you. Could you have forgiven Callum after discovering that the entire wedding was fake, even knowing why he did it? Or would his deception have been too much for you? Tell us what you would have done in the comments. I think there will be two very different sides to this one. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe and join us for another unforgettable story.